and welcome back, everybody. Welcome back from Britain Means Business, Britain Centre Stage, Growth Worth Sharing, or Beyond Britain's Borders. Have you all had a brilliant time in your respective breakouts? So I feel a bit panto. Have you all had a brilliant time in your respective breakouts? Woo! Loads of ideas, loads of hope flowing. In case you missed it this morning, I'm Sarah Hyde. I'm chair of the Fabian Society, and you are super, super welcome here today. Thank you again to the City of London, our hosts and our sponsors, ICAEW. We couldn't be doing this day without them, so thank you too for their generosity in enabling us to gather at the start of the year. Yeah, round of applause. Genuinely, this is such a collaborative effort today between these organisations and our hard-working teams, so really thank you again to them. So, here we all are, Great Hall, keynote speech. What remains for me to do now is to introduce this former young Fabian, former Fabian Vice Chair. I now here apparently is known for some other things than just being a Fabian. I mean, who knew? So it is such a joy to welcome to the stage our collaborator, our firm Fabian friend, the Secretary of State for Health and Social Care, Wes Streeting MP. Thank you.
I should still be young Fabian, really, if you save the age.
I would for you.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for inviting me here today to speak to the New Year Fabian Conference, and congratulations to our fantastic new General Secretary, Joe Dromey, for organising this in just 6 days. That's an amazing achievement. But of course, we know the whole Fabian team has been responsible for bringing us together in this amazing place. And as a former Vice Chair of the Fabian Society, I've spoken at countless Fabian conferences and events over the last decade. At those events, we did what Fabians do best. We debated policy, we made political arguments, we even published the odd pamphlet, and I would particularly like to commend to you the work of an unknown backbencher from Ilford North called Let Us Face the Future Again, which is available in all good bookshops. But this is the first Fabian conference I've addressed where I'm not talking about what a Labour government would do or should do, but what a Labour government has done and is doing to fulfil our historic mission, transforming society and improving people's lives. What we did last July was historic. Only the 4th time in Labour's history that a leader has led us from opposition to power with a thumping majority. And it's easy to forget how unlikely that outcome seemed when we met after the 2019 general election. And it's easy to forget just how enormous the challenge we inherited last July really is. Because when I look around the cabinet table, I see an education secretary with crumbling school buildings that don't have enough teachers inside. A justice secretary without enough prison places, a defence secretary facing down threats to our security in a more dangerous world, a transport secretary having to rebuild our creaking infrastructure, a deputy prime minister building our way out of a housing crisis, a chancellor having to balance all of these competing spending demands and making near impossible decisions, and a Prime Minister leading our country through all of these challenges simultaneously. It's hard, but I wouldn't trade a single day in government for a decade in opposition. Every day, I get to go into my department and do battle on behalf of patients and people who rely on social care to shift the dial back in their favour. We ended strikes and put resident doctors back on the front line. We hired more GPs to bring back the family doctor and funded home adaptations for an extra 15,000 disabled people, supporting them to live at home with renewed dignity, independence and happiness. That is what Labour in government to do, and that's much better than shouting from the sidelines. That's why we're in politics. That's why we're in politics. That's why we're in politics. That's why Labour's in politics, to make real change, not to shout from the sidelines. And it's why we stuck with it through the wilderness years. And of course, politics is personal. The NHS saved my life when I went through treatment for kidney cancer. And I can't think of a better way to repay the debt that I owe than by saving our NHS. And be in no doubt, it does need saving. During the general election campaign, I met people every day who've been let down by the NHS. A man in Nottingham told me about his 88-year-old mother who fell out of bed. And despite calling 999 again and again, she waited 3 hours on the floor before an ambulance was sent. I met an RAF veteran who was injured during service. He had been waiting 15 months for an operation on his spine, forced to take painkillers to get through each day. Most of the patients I met told me these stories to explain why they would be voting Labour to fix the NHS, but not all of them. I met people who had the most appalling experience, and because of how they'd been treated, they were voting for reform. On the progressive left, we often trumpet the NHS as a unifying national symbol. We proudly state that it unites Britain around values of care, compassion and equality. And at its best, it does. In 2012, when Danny Boyle was searching for a way of celebrating who we are as a nation, he turned the Olympic opening ceremony into a love letter for the National Health Service. But a failing NHS can have the reverse effect. It can make people question whether we can really afford to look after everyone who falls ill. When people are let down by the NHS, it can persuade them that the entire system needs shaking up. The failure of the health service points to a wider problem. If the NHS was broken, then the nation was broken. On the 75th anniversary of the NHS, an opinion poll showed that the health service makes the majority of Brits proud of our country, greater than the pride we feel for our history or our culture. But the same poll revealed that 7 in every 10 people believe the NHS's founding principle, healthcare free at the point of need, won't survive the next 10 years. The failure of our public services to meet the needs of the people is one of the fertilizers we see across a populism we see across liberal democracies. It breeds a cynicism about the ability of politics to deliver change and creates the conditions where the populist right thrive. People won't accept paying higher and higher taxes to fund a failing health service. And the lack of control people feel over their own lives is made worse by an analogue, computer says no NHS, which feels increasingly outdated in the modern age. That is why the Conservatives and Reform are rolling the pitch for Labour to fail on the NHS. They want us to fail. Because if we don't turn the NHS around, they will have the chance to beat us at the ballot box and overturn 76 years of universal healthcare, publicly funded, free at the point of need. Both of the alternative candidates for Prime Minister have opened the door to charging patients. Kemi Badenoch said last year that we need to have a serious cross-party national conversation about the principle of free at the point use. Nigel Farage has long advocated for an insurance model of healthcare. The founding principles of the NHS are now a contested issue in British politics for the first time in generations. The fate of our party and the fate of the health service we founded in 1948 are intertwined like never before. The populist right are coming for us, and we need to be serious about beating them. To buck the trend of incumbents booted out by populists, we have to do 3 things. suffocate their conspiracism with honesty, overcome their cynicism with hope by delivering real change, and take on their arguments to win the battle of ideas. Beating the populist right will require us to be honest with ourselves. Sometimes the centre-left can forget our purpose. It is not to blindly defend institutions because we share their values. Western liberal democracies are littered with the corpses of progressive political parties who found themselves defending the indefensible. The left finds it easy to acknowledge market failure, but can find it harder to acknowledge state failure. A failure to accept and embrace legitimate criticism of state institutions opens the door to the right to attack the very principle of collectivism. Conservatives exist to protect the status quo. Our purpose is to change it for the better. I've spent the past 6 months meeting the victims of the NHS. The widow whose husband died because the ambulance took too long to arrive. The grieving mother and uncle of a little boy who died of tonsillitis after being turned away from hospital and told there are no beds and not enough doctors. Women who lost their babies in childbirth in avoidable tragedies. That's why I said on day one in the job that the NHS is broken. It put a few noses out of joint. There were anonymous briefings from NHS managers who said it struck the wrong tone. And I can understand why, to some who value the NHS, it can be hard to hear. But I want patients to see that we've noticed, and I want staff to know that we've noticed too. Because if they don't trust that we get it, they won't trust us to turn it around. And most patients thought I was stating the bleeding obvious. Because thanks to the Conservatives' mismanagement, the NHS has failed people in our country for years. It's failed to meet its basic responsibility to be there for us when we need it. It has failed to be good value for money, and it has failed to change with the times. Yet every day, there are also outstanding episodes of care being delivered by dedicated people with sharp minds and big hearts, with groundbreaking medicine that was unimaginable a decade ago. They show us the future we can build together if we take the best of the NHS to the rest of the NHS. And that's the truth. The NHS is broken, but it's not beaten. And together, we will turn it around. The populist right feed on dishonesty and failure. Well, sunlight is the best disinfectant and honesty is the best policy. That's why we haven't shirked the scale of the challenge in the NHS. Culture is set from the top. The Conservatives are so embarrassed by their record, they avoid talking about the NHS at all. In fact, Kemi Badenoch gave a speech last week about the mistakes her party made in office, and surprisingly, it only lasted 20 minutes. But there were two glaring omissions. First, an apology. For the Conservatives, sorry seems to be the hardest word. Second, there was no mention at all of what she and her party did to our NHS. This Labour government has come under attack for acknowledging the dire inheritance we were left. But unlike the Conservatives, we will always be honest about the problems facing our country and serious about fixing them. People have lost faith that politics can be a force for good. It falls to us to prove them wrong. We've got to inspire some hope. I can't think of a more potent antidote to Farage's miserabilism than proving the cynics wrong and getting the NHS delivering world-class care every time. And in contrast to the false hope peddled by populists, our plan for change sets out the investment and reforms we're taking to turn that ambition into a reality. 17 new and expanded surgical hubs running like Formula One pit stops to bust through the backlogs. Patients able to book tests and scans on high streets and in the community on evenings and weekends. Rewarding trusts which cut waiting times fastest with extra capital investment, a new agreement with the independent sector to cut waiting times in working class towns and for women's gynae care. And since July, we've been ramping up to the 2 million extra appointments we promised in our manifesto. And it's not just a plan to get the NHS doing more. It's a plan to give patients greater control, to cut waste and modernise the health service. We'll cut more than 1 million missed appointments by sending reminders and giving patients the option to rearrange, as restaurants have been doing for years. By allowing GPs to refer patients directly for tests and scans, we'll cut out unnecessary specialist appointments. Offering patients the choice of whether they want routine follow-up appointments or not will free up 1 million pointless appointments a year so they can go to patients who really need them. And by paying GPs to treat more patients in the community closer to home instead of in hospitals, we'll shift the focus of healthcare out of hospitals and rebuild general practice. In just the past 4 months, thanks to the investment and reforms we're making, this Labour government has taken almost 150,000 patients off the waiting list and counting. Those patients are living proof of the difference a Labour government makes. If we did that in 4 months, imagine the difference we'll make in 5 years. Cutting the longest waiting times from 18 months to 18 weeks will mean achieving something the NHS hasn't achieved in a decade. And it will require going further and faster than even the last Labour government achieved. So it won't be easy, but I know it can be done. And if we do it, it will represent an act of resistance against the status quo of managed decline. We'll have helped make the case for progressive politics, and we can defeat Farage by turning around the NHS. But as we've seen in the US and around the world, delivery is essential, but it's not enough on its own. We have to take on the populist arguments and defeat them in the battle of ideas. And we should do so confidently. For all the coverage of Nigel Farage in recent weeks, all the speculation about whether he could be our country's next Prime Minister, there has almost been no reporting of what he would actually do in office. It's about time Reform's agenda was put under some scrutiny. Reform are proposing to end the NHS as a universal service, free at the point of use, and introduce an insurance model instead. And they would cut taxes on the private medical bills of the wealthy. They oppose Labour's investment in a better NHS for everyone. They would cut that investment and instead fund better healthcare just for the wealthiest. The crux of Farage's argument is this: what was possible in the 20th century isn't possible in the 21st. It's a miserabilist, declinist vision for Britain's future. People shouldn't have to choose between a health service that treats them on time and an NHS free at the point of use. That's a poverty of ambition for our country, and Labour utterly rejects it. Farage argues that tax cuts for private healthcare will ease pressure on the NHS. But the last 30 years proves the opposite is true. The last Labour government made the NHS so good, use of the private sector fell off a cliff. The Conservatives then reversed that record. As NHS waiting times soared, private healthcare saw a stampede of those who could afford it, while those who can't waited longer. People are right to say they've been left behind. They've been left behind by those who can afford to jump the queue and go private. The irony is that Farage, who preys on that sentiment, would cement this two-tier healthcare system. Labour is ending it, not just by cutting NHS waiting times, but by giving all patients the same choice, control and convenience that is currently just the preserve of the wealthy. When the wealthy receive a diagnosis, they often already know the best surgeon and can push to get the best care. But working class people can't. If the wealthy are told to wait months for treatment, they can shop around, but working class people can't. And if they pay top dollar, the wealthy can be treated with cutting-edge equipment and technology, but working class people can't. Labour's reform agenda is placing power in the hands of the many, not the few, giving all patients the same choice as the wealthy enjoy. If there is a private hospital that can treat patients faster than the NHS, they will soon be able to choose to be treated there, paid for by the state. Through the NHS app, patients will be able to book and rearrange appointments, see where waiting times are shortest, choose which hospital to be treated at, receive their test results, and opt to be seen in person or remotely. Through our investment in modern technology and AI-enabled equipment, alongside a new partnership with the life sciences sector developing the medicines of the future, we'll put patients, NHS patients, to the front of the queue for cutting-edge treatment. Because everyone deserves a world-class health service, not just the wealthy, and that's an argument progressives can win against the populists any day of the week. So while we've had to take some unpopular decisions in the last 6 months, we've taken those decisions to get our country out of the massive hole it was left in by the Conservatives. The same Conservatives who have the audacity to carp and criticise like a bunch of arsonists attacking the fire brigade for not arriving soon enough. But in the last 6 months, we've done a lot of good too. Angela Rayner's delivering the New Deal for working people. Bridget Phillipson is putting breakfast clubs in every primary school. Lou Haig set up Great British Railways. Ed Miliband is switching on Great British Energy. Yvette Cooper stopped the racist riots. And Shabana Mahmood made sure prison was waiting for the thugs responsible. Pat McFadden is reforming public services. Peter Kyle is bringing the tech revolution to government so we have public services in our pockets. And there is so much more going on besides. The challenges we face are enormous, but so are the possibilities. I wouldn't swap the hardest day in government for the best day in opposition. So thanks to the support of Rachel Reeves and Darren Jones, in the last 6 months, I've ended the strikes, cut red tape to employ 1,000 more GPs onto the front line by April, delivered the biggest funding packages for hospices in a generation, the biggest capital investment in the NHS since Labour was last in power, £889 million to fix the front door to the NHS and bring back the family doctor. And on social care, Angela Rayner and I are delivering fair pay agreements for care workers. Liz Kendall is delivering the biggest expansion of carers allowance since the 1970s. And the home adaptations through the Disabled Facilities Grant doesn't just mean new ramps or handrails, accessible kitchens and bathrooms. It means independence, dignity, freedom and quality of life. That is what our politics is about, changing lives. So let's get stuck into 2025 with hope, optimism and confidence about Britain and its future. And let's never forget how far we've come. People said Keir Starmer couldn't win the Labour leadership, and he did. They said he couldn't change the Labour Party, and he did. They said he couldn't win a general election, and he did. Now they say he can't change our country, but he will. A lot done, a hell of a lot more to do. Change has only just begun, and the best is still to come. Thank you very much.
Well, Wes, thanks so much for that. Ladies and gentlemen, hello. My name is Lewis Goodall. I'm from the Newsagents podcast. I'm sure as good Fabians, you're all listeners. Apparently, I'm at the top of every Fabian podcast episode. But of course, you probably all know that as devoted listeners. If anyone's got anything else they'd like to get off their chest now, perhaps they'd like to do so. No. Well, that's very polite, but no, thank you. Wes, that was
I can't believe there are only two. I'm really quite offended, actually.
Yeah, well.
I'm sure David Lammy got more than this when he came here.
Wes, we were saying just before we came on that this is my fourth interview of the year with you. Not that you do a lot of interviews, of course. So lucky old me, and a really interesting speech. Maybe let's just start with something really big. Your speech was about how progressives make an argument against populists in the 21st century, and also about the importance of delivery, and we'll get to delivery. But let's start big picture. I'm very clear what Donald Trump, what Nigel Farage, what their politics is, what they think the aim and objective of their politics is. It can be less clear what the point of progressive politics is in the 21st century. What is it?
It's the same as it's ever been, which is the redistribution of power, wealth and opportunity. So it sits in the hands of the many, not the few. That is the kind of core ethos, the core set of values, the driving objective of Labour politics. And the failure to do that, the failure to achieve that, is what creates the fertile ground in which populism grows.
So is it inequality that is the problem? Is it still the driving moral mission of progressive politics to lessen inequality?
Yeah, and it's why people are turning to the populists, because if you look at the people who voted for Donald Trump, if you look at the people who voted for European populists, the people who voted for Brexit, the thing that they have in common in each of those kind of democratic events is the sense that they work really hard, but they don't feel that they get reward for their work and their effort. So you've got people holding down 2 or 3 jobs and still not able to make ends meet, let alone enjoy the things that make life worth living. They don't feel the power, they don't feel control over their lives, and worse still, they feel that the people in power don't understand the pressures in their lives and aren't acting in their interests. And you can only defeat that kind of politics with real solutions to those problems. And Labour is ideally placed, progressive politics is ideally placed to do that. But we haven't been in power for more than a decade in this country. And ironically, it feels like you don't have long to deliver change, because people want to see it, they want to feel it here and now. But change takes time, and real change takes time. And so we've got to explain at every point that we're in government what we're doing, why we're doing it, the difference we're making, without at any point sounding complacent or triumphalist when there are still so many challenges yet to solve.
I mean, you say that it is important that you win the battle of ideas, and you take the arguments to the populists to win the battle of ideas. Of course, Nigel Lawson once said famously that the party which wins the battle of ideas wins. Do you think you're winning the battle of ideas right now?
We did a pretty good job last July.
But did you?
I think we did.
No, you won the election, but did you win the battle of ideas? Do you really think that progressive politics over the last 6 months has ideologically been on the front foot?
Well, it depends on whether you're talking domestically or internationally.
Both.
And I would like, if you look at elections around the world, they are increasingly difficult for incumbents because people are not experiencing a level of change that they need, actually, and not even want, but need. And I think the lesson from the US presidential election we've just seen is that delivery matters, but in and of itself it isn't enough. Are people feeling the change? Our friends in the Australian Labour Party had some real difficulties midterm, because actually they had a tremendous record of delivery. They were delivering their manifesto, but people were kind of saying, okay, but am I feeling it? And the other thing about politics is it's always about the future, it's not about the past. So even as this government is delivering, we have to remind people we're delivering, because if you don't talk about your success, and no one else will, so you have to get your message across. But you always have to say what you're doing next, and you always have to be looking to the future, and you always have to be acknowledging that things aren't good enough. It's why, I've been very keen to emphasise in my role as Health and Social Care Secretary that we haven't wasted a minute, we haven't wasted a day in the last 6 months. There's a hell of a lot we've been doing, but I'm also not going to walk around hospitals at the moment or care homes and say, aren't we doing brilliantly? Look at the state of the health service and look at the people on trolleys in corridors. So I've gone out to visibly acknowledge and own the challenges in the NHS so that people know that firstly we are delivering and we're doing what we said we would, because that's important for trust, but also we're not going to be satisfied until the NHS is in a state that the public can be proud of and the people who work in it can be proud of. And I want this to be the year in which staff in the NHS start feeling like they're working in an improving NHS again, and that patients feel like the NHS is on the road to recovery. That's my main goal for 2025. But I'm not going to overpromise, which is why I said, look, I can't promise there won't be any trolleys on corridors next winter, because in all likelihood there will be. But what I can reassure people is I'm never going to defend that position and normalise corridor care. It's my objective to end corridor care in the NHS. It will take time. Give me some time. Give me the benefit of the doubt as we're doing it. But in the meantime, I want patients and staff to think finally, a government is dealing with this. I can see that the NHS is improving. I'm going to give these people the time and space to get on with it. And then at the next election, I'm going to judge them on how far they've come. And that's the central test of the next election for Labour. Is Britain in a better place than we found it? If the public feel the answer is yes, they're more likely to give us permission to carry on.
But Wes,
if not, they'll look to the alternatives.
But you've already alluded to this, which is that if the Biden administration and their experience teaches us anything, surely it is delivery isn't enough. And you can deliver. Biden did a lot in all sorts of different ways. But not only did people not feel it, but on some level they didn't see it anywhere. The way that the populist right in America have controlled the narrative, the way that Trump has been extremely good at controlling the narrative in a way that Biden just ceded the narrative in so many ways, doesn't that give you a lot of lessons or teach you a lot about how the Labour Party and how this Labour government has to approach communications in the next 4 years?
Well, certainly at every stage in the next 4 or 5 years, we need to be explaining what we're doing, why we're doing it, the difference we're making.
Do you think you've done
that? But there's something a bit more fundamental about communication.
Do you think you've done that well enough so far in the last 6 months?
Well, I think that in the last 6 months, one thing that, and the argument I've been making actually since just before Christmas is to just acknowledge, as I did in my speech, that we've made some unpopular decisions, and to tell the public that we knew they were unpopular decisions when we were making them, and then to explain why we were making unpopular decisions. I don't want people to think across the country we made unpopular decisions by accident, we didn't think about it, or we were careless. Quite the opposite. But also to say, look, the reason we've made some decisions we knew you thought would be unpopular is because we've had to get Britain out of a massive hole. And you will not thank us in 4 years' time if we did government by gimmick, short-term sticking plasters, and the triumph of false hope over real change, because that's where we've been. But back to your point about communication, because I sometimes get frustrated with the debate about political communication and, is the press office doing a good enough job, and is the
I don't think it would be the press office that people would be blaming.
Because the whole point about communication is the communication can only be good as the message and the product or the government that you're selling. And I'd say that for the Labour Party at this moment, we have to look at the world around us and look at where we are in British politics. And you can't just sell your policies, you also have to sell your ideas, because there are some fundamental things about our country, about democracy, about the role of the state, about the role of international institutions, which are now highly contested in a way that they have never been at any point in my lifetime of 42 years. These things are now contested, and you have to be sleeves rolled up, engaged in that battle of ideas. So to meet the big, and this is where I think Keir Starmer absolutely gets it. If you think about what Keir was saying in opposition about the missions of this government and how we would approach them, firstly, it's saying actually whether you are delivering economic justice, whether you are improving our NHS, improving life chances for kids, switching on green energy and clean power, whether you are making our streets safe and tackling violence against women and girls, you cannot do those things without active government. That's now contested. So you have to make the case for active government, and you have to make the case now for politics as a force for good. But he also said government can't do this alone. You need to work in partnership with business, with civil society, the trade unions, and all of us as citizens. So this is a partnership, this is a team. All of those things are contested between the left and the right, and we've got to be in that argument. You look at the world at the moment, international institutions are coming under enormous pressure. But I would argue extremely strongly that for all of its faults, we've got to make the United Nations work, not pull it down. The World Health Organization is absolutely vital for the health of the planet, and it's in our national self-interest to be engaged in the World Health Organization, as well as the interests of common humanity. And of course, NATO, the cornerstone of democratic defence since it was created by, among others, the Labour government in the 1940s. But these are now contested issues, and we need to be engaged in the battle of ideas about why it is right that we have active government, about why it is right we have collective solutions to problems in our country, and why it is right that we have collective leadership across the world to deal with the big challenges, whether they are global poverty or climate change.
But do you think that, as it goes, go back to Trump, this is a man who knows and understands that in order to succeed in a modern political media environment, you have to be everywhere all at once. On every media channel available to you, you have to be dominating the narrative. Put it bluntly, do you think Keir Starmer is the best communicator the Labour Party could have as its leader?
I think the great thing about Keir Starmer, and the thing that I think is his superpower, despite the fact that you know there's implied criticism in your question, is
probably
that,
not totally unfair.
To put it politely, your question, I think his superpower is, and it's often seen as a weakness, but I think it's a strength, that he has come from outside politics. He doesn't have...
But he's not perceived that way.
He doesn't have a great deal of patience for political game playing, for pointless political theatre. He holds some of the way in which politics is conducted in contempt because he sees it as an obstacle to delivering real change for people. So he's a man of substance, and what he cares about, and what he certainly, I feel, held to account by, and I'm sure other members of the Cabinet feel the same, is are we delivering real change for people? Are we delivering what we said that we would do for people? That's what he holds us to account to, like to deliver real change for people. And it's very easy, and we see this with the Faragists, sort of the sirens calling us to the rocks, with kind of false hope. And I think the best antidote to that false hope is the politics of real change, and I think that's what Keir represents.
How much of a problem is it for the Labour government, for progressive politics in general, that not only are the ideological tides sort of running opposite you around the world, but you've got Donald Trump in the White House now, rather than Joe Biden, as the leader of that movement? How much of a problem is it for you?
Well, the approach we're taking to the new Trump administration is the same approach that every British government and every British Prime Minister has taken, which is recognition of the deep and existential nature of this alliance, special relationship, essential relationship, however you want to characterise it. It is broad, it is deep, it is the cornerstone of our defence and security. And the relationship between the British Prime Minister and the American President matters. That's why Keir Starmer and David Lammy have invested so much in building the relationship with the Republican Party ahead of the US presidential election, to get to know President Trump and Vice President Vance in the way that they have, to be able to anticipate what their goals and objectives are, to find common ground where we can, disagree where we must, and to conduct ourselves in a way that you would expect two countries that are such close friends to engage with each other. And that's how we're approaching this, at the same time as we're recognizing that, you know, Europe is still our nearest and largest trading partner, and our European defence has never felt higher on the agenda. And then to look across the rest of the world at other relationships that the UK has, other influence we can bring to bear, and the way in which we can use our convening power to defend and stand by multilateral engagement to big challenges facing our world, whether they are war and conflict, poverty and famine, or the challenges brought by climate change.
Sure, I get all that. And of course, that's quite boilerplate for a UK-US government. But what I'm asking is something a bit more specific, which is it a problem that you've articulated today how progressives should respond basically to the populist right in this country, but clearly the person who is making those arguments most comprehensively is Donald Trump, the person you've just said is at the centerpiece of this UK-US relationship. So I'm just wondering the extent to which you feel and the Labour government now feels on the back foot ideologically because of the massive changes we're seeing across the world, of which Donald Trump is at the forefront?
No, I certainly feel that we feel confident in our politics and in our values, and we feel mindful as
you haven't felt that you might want to reassess anything in the wake of the Trump victory of what you think about your politics, about progressive values, about how salient they are to the public at large and the electorate at large?
No, I think we feel in the Starmer government that it's our responsibility at this moment in history to be the light on the hill for progressives around the world.
Would
not
Keir
the last
Starmer
ones
take
to turn
the
out
knee?
the lights, and that's our determination.
As an example of what I mean, do you think it's credible or imaginable that Keir Starmer and Angela Rayner would take the knee today in the way that they did back in 2021, when the ideological currents were firmly flowing in progressive's direction?
I think sorry, I couldn't quite hear the beginning.
I was saying, would you think Keir Starmer and Angela Rayner would take the knee in the way that they did back in 2021 today? Do you think that they would engage in that form of cultural politics today?
I mean, that was a response to a moment in time and a particular injustice. I think that there are going to be big arguments about diversity, inclusion, about the kind of country we want to be. And, I think that, if I think about my role as Health and Social Care Secretary and how I approach it, yes, I want to cut NHS waiting times. And I want to make sure that we are seeing fewer lives lost to the biggest killers. I want to build a national care service worthy of the name. I also want to tackle the gross health inequalities that blight our society. And to do that, we need to acknowledge that black women are 3 times more likely to die in childbirth than white women. And by the way, some people might think, well, no, it's 4 actually. No, it's 3, because now there are more white working class women dying in childbirth, so we're closing the gap in the wrong way. Black men are twice more likely to die of prostate cancer than white men. There are real inequalities in people's experience of healthcare, and I want to acknowledge them and address them and tackle them. And so you can see that this is a government that will be driven by its values and will do what we think is in the best interest of our country and show leadership, and we will make different choices. It wasn't a surprise that the Trump administration is withdrawing from the World Health Organization, because President Trump was clear with the American people when he was seeking their mandate that he would do so. This country is making a different choice. We are the biggest contributor of unrestricted funding to the World Health Organization. And this week I reaffirmed to the Director General that we will continue to do so.
Do you think it's a real problem that the US have withdrawn from it in terms of global health and global health security?
It will bring its challenges, but it's not a surprise. And to be fair to President Trump, he was clear ahead of the US election that is what he would do. That's the mandate he got. That's the mandate he's following through. So it wasn't a surprise to me. It wasn't a surprise to the Director General of the World Health Organization or any of the WHO's members. We have to respond and adapt to that. That's the world we are in. That's the choice that the American people made and the choice that their government has made. I disagree with it. I respect their right to make a different decision. What we will do is engage with the World Health Organization and with members of the World Health Organization to make sure that it's still able to respond to the global health challenges, which not only see people dying disproportionately in places like Central Africa and in conflict zones around the world, but also the World Health Organization does a job through multilateral engagement that keeps us safe and provides the early warning and the early detection and the management of health risks that, if unmanaged, unmitigated, untreated, would soon arrive on our shores, and we would be picking up the consequences.
Again, in terms of that direction of politics, I mean, you mentioned health inequalities there. Again, to take some of those touchstone issues over the last couple of years, would you still be comfortable in saying, and you would say, that Britain has structural racism?
Well, it's just objectively true.
But specifically that theory, you would say that Britain is structurally racist.
But you can see that. You can see that borne out. I mean, and actually the NHS is a really great example of what I mean by this. This is an institution, and it's no coincidence, was founded in the same year that the Empire Windrush arrived in this country. That Windrush generation and their children, their grandchildren, increasingly great-grandchildren, were a key part of building the National Health Service. But talk to black nurses today about their experience of racist bullying, and Asian staff for that matter as well. It happens in the NHS, even an organisation whose values are about diversity and inclusion. Black women are dying disproportionately to white women, not because gynecologists and obstetricians and midwives are racist, but because we're not addressing the underlying health risks that particularly exist for black women. And if we don't acknowledge them, and if we don't understand that inequality, you don't tackle and address it. Meanwhile, on the flip side, I've had challenges with parts of the NHS on the diversity and inclusion agenda that undermine the cause for equality, like the member of NHS staff who was recruiting for a new member of their team, describing their practice and said that part of their practice was anti-whiteness. Now, when you've got white people in this country, in working class communities, who are more likely to die because of their poverty and inequality, how does it help to say that your practice is anti-white? Like, this is a nonsense.
But you think the government
I'm afraid that kind of ideologically driven nonsense undermines the fundamental case for equality, diversity and inclusion.
But
so I'm going to clamp down on that and make sure that we stick to the fundamentals of making sure that everyone, whatever their background, receives outstanding care. And I think making those arguments from first principles, that's how you win people around who might otherwise be looking at the newspapers and thinking, well, actually, the NHS is struggling, so why do we have these diversity and inclusion people?
But you think,
well, as long as they're making sure that we've got all staff being treated with care and respect, and that all patients are receiving high-quality care regardless of their background, we can justify it. If people are using these posts for ideological hobby horses, well, that's when you get into trouble, and it makes me angry because I believe in equality, diversity and inclusion.
You think the government should remain...
behaviours undermine the case for it.
You think the government should remain committed to the diversity, equality and inclusion agenda?
Well, we are. We are a party of equality. I think we need to make sure that we're focused on the fundamentals and getting the basics right and not being pulled off into the politics of sociology seminars. With respect to sociologists, but
we imagine one or two in here, I would imagine.
I know it's a wrong crowd.
Very much so.
For this.
Very much so.
I should have gone.
You just lost them, Wes. You just lost them.
But no, there really is a serious point here, and the reason I feel passionate about this is because I do think that sometimes that kind of ideologically driven, gimmicky. Gesture politics when it comes to equality and diversity and inclusion has actually contributed to the reaction we see and the opposition we see to an agenda that should be fundamentally inclusive. And if you know that you're more likely to die prematurely as a white working class bloke in Wigan, if you know that you're more likely to die from suicide as a young man, how do you think those people feel if then they see that the agenda that should be speaking to them, that's about tackling their health inequalities, that's about getting fairness for them, says actually we're about anti-whiteness, or men's health? Sorry, we can't talk about that because we're about women's health now. Like, we've got to be about everyone. And we've got to make sure that an agenda that's about equality of outcomes is genuinely about equality of outcomes and recognises some of the gross inequalities in our society. And I do think, and I've done a lot of reflection on this as someone who's worked in this area and campaigned in this area for decades, actually. It's one of the things that got me excited about the Labour Party, especially as a young gay man growing up in this country. And I think, like, how do we go so wrong when a party that was founded by and for the working classes basically said to a whole bunch of men in this country, and it is particularly men, no, sorry, our equalities agenda isn't for you. Really? When white working class boys in Hartlepool get poorer outcomes than white working class boys in Hackney even, there are real inequalities that affect our society, and many of them are intersectional between different working class communities, black, Asian and white working class communities, but there are particular challenges that affect working class communities, of course, working class men in particular, working class boys in particular, and the left has got to be with them, for them. In fact, the whole language of them and us is completely wrong on this issue. Like, this is who we are as a party. We are together. I joined the Labour Party as a white working class teenager because I thought this is the party for me, and the working class bit mattered to me as every much as the gay bit.
Just on... Given that it is your area as well, and it's sort of linked to what you were just saying, Trump has said that the federal government health department, Health and Human Services Department, will only be recognising 2 genders from now on. What do you think about that? And do you think that there is any possibility of the UK government doing the same?
Well, sex matters. Biology matters. It matters particularly in a health context. I also want this country to be a place where trans people feel safe, feel included, and feel respected. And I know that particularly within my community, the LGBT community, that's not the case, that people in the trans community feel very afraid in our country right now. They look at some of the decisions I have made as the health secretary through a lens that questions my motives, let alone questions the decisions. And that sort of breaks my heart, actually, because I want this to be a country where everyone, whatever their background, can achieve their full potential and have the same security and the same opportunities as anyone else, where who you are doesn't matter. What you've got to offer is all that counts. And we've got a lot of work to do, I think, on this issue. But I've never found it difficult respecting other people's gender identities. What I've tried to do as a leader in the Labour Party is to help navigate our country and actually navigate our party through what have been some quite thorny issues that have pitted people who would otherwise agree with each other against each other on things like women's only, the sex-based rights of women, women's only spaces. But
just to reassure trans people, as far as you're concerned, while you're health secretary, you would never get to a position where your department would only formally, officially recognise 2 genders.
Well, as I say, sex matters, but I also want to make sure people's gender identities are respected. And that's particularly important in the context of the care that people receive and the wide range of care that trans people need to access in the NHS. And I don't want a trans person to walk through the door of any NHS service and feel afraid that they're going to be judged or excluded or treated less well because of who they are and how they identify. I want the NHS to be safe for everyone, and that's my strong commitment. That's the commitment of this government.
So yes, you will always recognise that there's more than 2 genders.
Yeah, I recognise that people define in different ways. For the NHS, we've got to make sure that people are treated with care and respect. And
you've got a couple of minutes left. You said something very interesting, I thought, in your speech. Lots of interesting things, but this in particular. You said that you alluded to the idea that too often the left or progressives had defended institutions, had become too institutionalist. Do you think that is... would you say that was the case in terms of what we've just seen in Southport?
Well, actually, I think that this government has responded to that horrific attack with the same degree of outrage that I think is felt right across the country, and in particular, the deep distress, actually, that this was someone who came into contact with a number of state services, including those that are supposed to catch and prevent killers like him. And I think that, again, thinking about our Prime Minister and his background, he is someone who, through the law, has railed against injustice and state failure. And he is someone who, as Prime Minister, will rail against injustice and state failure too. And, you know, the other thing I would say about Southport is, for all of the criticisms that we might make of the NHS today and where the NHS gets it wrong, my God, the best people I've ever met in my entire life were the NHS heroes who responded to that unimaginable scene that day. And spending time at the hospital there at Alderhay and meeting the teams and listening to these people describe how they did it, the professionalism they operated under, the care and attention went down to every single bit, from the staff who were fielding the calls from distressed parents coming in on the phone, the porters who did their best to make sure other people couldn't or didn't see these children's bodies coming through on trolleys in the corridors. The first responder who had to make those split decisions of who to see, who to triage, in what order when he was confronted with that scene. My God, these people are amazing. And they are the very best of the NHS, and that is why that institution really matters.
And I think we could all support that. I think the reason I ask about it in particular is because it links to something else you mentioned in your speech, which is the rise of conspiracy and conspiracism, especially, to be honest, on the right of politics, and certainly the hard right of politics. And we have seen, even with in the last couple of days around Southport, I'm sure you will have seen it, a prolific volume of conspiracy, often propagated or suggested or hinted at by quote-unquote mainstream political actors. We've seen it happen a lot, even just this year. We're only not even at the end of January. How does, not just the left, not just progressives, but the government, mainstream politicians more generally, how do we take that on? Because it is becoming more and more pervasive and a bigger part of politics.
And it is contested. So, and this is where having the fight and making the argument really matters. The reason we did not provide a running commentary about what happened in the run-up to that awful attack, the circumstance of the attack, the nature of the individual and his background, is because we were under no illusion that had we done so, we might well have prejudiced the trial and prevented a safe prosecution and denied those poor little girls and their families the justice that they deserve. Now, it is one thing for some bloke in his pants on the internet to question that and tweet about that and to imply that somehow there's been some kind of state cover-up. It is quite something else to see conservative politicians who should know better fueling that kind of conspiracy theorist politics. And for that matter, what has happened to the mainstream Conservative Party that Nigel Farage and Reform have been more robust in calling out Tommy Robinson than the official opposition? What has happened to the Conservative Party? So this is why I go back to the point about fundamentals. The independence of the judiciary, the rule of law, these things matter. They have not been contested in modern politics, but they are coming under increasing attack. And you have to kind of see some of this challenge and some of the anger and resentment that's felt in the country against a catalogue of failures. You know, you can understand why people are cynical about government and whether it can be trusted and whether it will deliver when you look at the conduct of our predecessors and the litany of broken promises and the broken rules and the double standards. You can understand why the public are cynical about the media media, given some of the media practices we've seen in our country. You can understand why they're critical of the church, why they're critical of the city, why they're critical of charities, why they're critical of judges, why they're critical of the judiciary. The challenge is, these are the pillars that hold up a democratic and civilized society. And so there's a real danger when all of those pillars are under simultaneous attack, and where there is deep-rooted and understandable cynicism about each of those pillars that underpin a democratic society. And that's why we really do need to go back to the basics, making the arguments about the fundamentals of what underpins a fair and equal and democratic and free society, because some of these principles are now contested, and the conduct of politicians and politics is not as honourable as it once was. But we have to hold ourselves to the standards that we want to see from others, and we have to make the argument for democracy, freedom, human rights, the rule of law, as if they were as contested as they were 100 years ago, because I think that's where we are today.
Wes, just got to wrap up, but very specifically, you talk about the man in his pants online tweeting, horrible idea, tweeting about what had happened in Southport. But when you talk about politicians then making similar suggestions, I mean, would you include, therefore, Kemi Badenoch and Nigel Farage? Nigel Farage tweeted, "The cover-up is over." And Kemi Badenoch said, while the government inquiry is a step in the right direction, it falls short of what is needed. Why wasn't he apprehended sooner? And two, the transparency of information during, after, and during the unrest that followed this barbaric incident, both therefore hinting at problems around the transparency of information. What would your message be to them specifically?
I would say it is absolutely right, and this government will ask hard questions about why we did not stop this killer. That is the right question, and we have to leave no stone unturned on that and leave nothing unsaid or nothing uncovered or left without being uncovered, to make sure that we have a common understanding about what went wrong, and then we can take the necessary steps to try and prevent something like this happening again. What I really resent is this idea that along the way we've tried to take steps or actions to spare any political blushes or spare the blushes of any public services that have fallen short. What we've done at every point along the way is what I think responsible government does, which is to respond to the immediate aftermath of the event, and make sure we were doing everything we could from that moment, make sure that the killer was brought to justice, and to make sure that, of course, we ask the hard questions and look at where the failure was, and also in the meantime, where we're identifying shortcomings, we take action now. We don't always have to wait for inquiries to get on as well, and that's what we've done. But the idea that there's been a cover-up is ludicrous nonsense.
And you think they're being irresponsible?
I think it is. I really do think it's irresponsible. I really do. And it just sort of says to people, it sort of fuels that idea that governments, there's always that secret agenda. I mean, as I say, maybe I've not hit the big time yet, but, I've not been invited to any Illuminati meetings in the last 6 months, or ever for that matter, for the people who go, but you said only 6 months.
It's coming.
It must have been 7 months ago he was there. This is not healthy. There are things that governments get wrong, that's why you have to be honest about it and own it. But my general experience of politics, and I say this about many of the people I've faced in the House of Commons in the last decade, most people I've seen elected to politics and to Parliament over the last decade or more, whatever their party affiliation, have tended to be good people with honourable intentions, who are there because they genuinely want to make their communities and our country a better place. We disagree about how to do that. That's the ground on which contested democratic politics is fought. That is a good thing. But we seem to have forgotten some of those fundamental things about respecting your opponents, their opponents, not enemies, about making sure that politics is a battle of ideas, not a battle of personalities, to make sure politics is about public service, not self-service. So again, we're having to relitigate some of these basic fundamental things and to reassert what government, politics and democracy should be about. Because if we don't succeed, there, other systems are available and not a single one of them would be desirable in my opinion.
And just on that, Wes, finally, just on that, to go back to your speech, which is all about how the left defeats populism. If you can't deliver, and if that doesn't happen, and if you can't do what you said with the NHS, do you think that a reform government, a populist government, a hard-right populist government is possible here? Do you think Farage could be Prime Minister? Is that what you have in your mind, and is that what you think that the battle is to try and prevent?
Well, I'd say two things. Firstly, there is definitely a battle going on at the moment for the soul of the British right. And I don't think it's obvious yet whether the Conservative Party or the Reform Party emerges as the dominant party of the British right. And it's our job to be ready to take both of them on. I don't like complaining about the media, because it's a bit like complaining about the weather. And it goes back to my
point. Here we go.
But also, there is a bit of me sometimes, but I've kind of given up on this, where Nigel Farage achieved a breakthrough at the last election with 5 MPs. I think the Greens got roughly the same number, 4 or 5. No one's saying, Carla Denyer, come on down. Are you the next progressive Prime Minister in our country? Ed Davey got the best result the modern Liberal Party has ever achieved. The Liberal Democrats have never got that many MPs. No one's saying, step forward Prime Minister Ed Davey.
You didn't mention him in your speech, Wes, to be fair. We haven't had
mania for Ed Davey mania hasn't happened. I do think there has become this obsession. I do think it's kind of driven by social media, what has reach, what gets clicked, like serve the clicks, get the reach, rather than provide the serious analysis. I mean, let's not get too carried away about Nigel Farage. I want to take on the ideas. I think we should the guy gets so much airtime for someone who, and this is one of his superpowers actually, but the guy gets so much air powers. He got 5 MPs at the last election, and he doesn't shine in the House of Commons. And I think we should just keep it all in perspective. Whoever emerges on the right as the primary candidate for Prime Minister at the next election from the right, let's be ready to take them on. But in the meantime, in 2025, let's put our best foot forward. Let's assert our ideas, our vision, our values, and let's deliver for the country.
I would, of course, just gently point out that the Secretary of State's press release ahead of this speech was fix the NHS to defeat Farage. But anyway, we'll leave that to one side. That's for our 5th interview of the year. Ladies and gentlemen, I found that absolutely fascinating. I'm sure you did as well. Please put your hands together and show your appreciation for Wes Streeting, Secretary of State for Health.